Welcome back everyone, I'm Sugary Sweet, and you are watching Battle 8 of my Shining Force 3 Scenario 1 Insane Mode Efficiency playthrough. So, as mentioned in the previous map, this map actually immediately follows the last one. If you don't allow yourself to cast Egress, the game automatically shuffles you into this map, so you have to go straight into it without being able to restock your items or anything like that. And of course I'm also unable to trade items around, so Dontaras is still holding onto the Protect Ring, which I obtained from a chest in the ruins in the last map. That's important in this case because this map has a very interesting side objective that tends to frustrate a lot of new players, because if you play it enough it makes it seem like that there's only really one solution to the problem, or at least there's only one general solution with very little wiggle room, which is mostly true in this case, especially if you want to low turn the map like I'm trying to do. So obviously you've already seen at the beginning of the map that we are at a switching point for a train. The context of this is that after the battle in the warehouse at the beginning of Chapter 2, because obviously we couldn't really stick around in a warehouse anymore because we made too much of a ruckus, the Force had to figure out a different way to get onto the train, and that's when they met Julian, who's just a wandering mercenary, but he seems to have some kind of ulterior motive for helping the Shining Force go find a train. But since the party doesn't really have that many options available to him, they decide to trust him. So the party has now reached a switching point for the train, which is where we plan on boarding it to get back to the Republic. And as you can see at the beginning of this map, there is a bunch of refugees who are also trying to get onto the train. And they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. They were escaping from the Empire to the Republic seeking a better life, and they happened to run into General Varlant, who was the guy covering our escape way back in Chapter 1. But basically, constant fighting seems to have driven him completely mad. So he basically said something like, well, the Republic needs soldiers, so we're going to draft you or we're going to kill you. And a bunch of Imperial soldiers also spotted the refugees and were like, you guys are betraying the Empire, so we're going to kill you. Obviously, Symbios's army is the protagonist's army, so they are goody goods and they're going to stop this atrocity from happening. So while Symbios's army fights the Imperial soldiers trying to catch the refugees, General Varlant is actually being kept busy by Prince Medion, who also happens to come here at the same time. And if you play Scenario 2, you actually get to play the other half of the map. So that's just one of those fun things between Scenario 1 and 2 with Shining Force 3, where you get to play a lot of the same conflicts within the story from a different angle. By going back to the map itself that we're actually playing, obviously the difficulty here comes from saving the refugees. Now thankfully, unlike Garrosh, Hayward, or Irene that we saw in previous maps, the game actually allows you to control the refugees yourself. So at the very least there isn't that frustrating element of you struggling against the AI of the game. But it is a pretty difficult task when you're playing for the first time because unexpected things can happen because you can't completely predict what the AI will do in response to the refugees. And you yourself obviously are not completely clear as to how you should intercept the enemy forces to stop the refugees from getting killed. So obviously you can see what I'm doing is something that is inadvisable in a lot of RPGs. We're splitting the party. The low movement scrubs are going to make their way towards the boss slowly. And you can see on turn 2 I used Masquerade to luring one of the soldiers. So I need to make sure to lure them in and kill them in a very sequential way so that I don't get overwhelmed. Because you can see that all my tankier units also happen to be the ones that are making their way towards the tracks. But the low movement frailer units does include both my healers, so that's just how the map has to go. And that again is another reason why the Protect Ring being on Dontaras is a nice bonus to him getting it in the first place. I have to rely on healing herbs to keep everyone healthy, and I can use the heal too from the Protect Ring to heal someone up if I really need to in a pinch. So speaking of that group, you can tell that the units that make up that group are the ones that have at least 6 move. They are the only ones who can cross the train tracks before the train that is closer to the party will get in the way and block us from crossing it. And it's important to get over there for 3 different reasons. First, you want to get to the switch point so that you can change the track on the further train to make sure it goes the long way around, because if you don't do that, the refugees are not going to be able to make it across the train tracks before the train blocks their way, and they're just going to get killed by all the Imperial soldiers. And after that, you can see there's also an Imperial soldier and 2 snipers in the middle of the train tracks, so if we don't get anybody over there, even if the refugees make it across the train tracks, those guys are going to run over and kill them. Now there is a way that you can kind of screw with the AI a bit to make them move in a strange way so that they basically completely stop paying attention to the refugees for some reason, but it can't be consistently done and I'm actually not entirely sure what triggers it. The final reason you want to make it across the train tracks and hit the switch early is because there is actually a hidden item that you can find if you check one of the boliters that is within the alternate track for the further train. It contains a Gale Ring, which increases the equipped unit's defense and agility, and you can have some fun shenanigans with it, which you will probably see in some future chapters. So you can see that the high movement group is about to cross the train tracks here. Dontarez is obviously going to be the one to hit the switch. He has the highest movement with 7 move. And you can see that before I hit the switch, I kind of shuffle around a little bit before I'm able to do so. So the reason for this is that in this game, you can actually interact with objects from a diagonal tile. But in order to do that, you have to very deliberately face the character's sprite towards the object that you're trying to interact with. And this is one of those things where the isometric view of the game combined with slightly finicky controls when you're moving around can make it kind of difficult to execute perfectly in a short amount of time. In fact, in some other takes of this battle that I tried, like I kind of had to shuffle around for like a full 10 seconds before I was able to face Dontarez the right direction because of how annoying it was. So it's just one of those minor annoying things that comes from the presentation of the game. I mean, the isometric view does look very cool, but it does kind of lead to annoying situations like this one. And I guess this is as good as any place to quickly mention this, is that because of the free-flowing or whatever movement that you can have in this game within your movement ranges, there's actually a way for you to cause a glitch in the movement in the game for you to move beyond your typical movement range. So if you use an analog controller, you can actually cause the movement cursor to move outside your movement range by kind of pushing and wiggling against the corners of your movement. I think it's just kind of a strange bug this game has from using an analog controller, and I'm not even sure if you can replicate this on actual hardware. Obviously, I'm not going to be doing that here, but it's just kind of a funny way for, I guess, newer players to manipulate and make this map easier if you were so inclined. Also, you're about to see Grace get one of her elusive crits. She gets to fire a laser, which is pretty funny. We're obviously not going to make Grace attack a lot during this run, but it's just kind of amusing that I got the opportunity to show that off. So obviously you're about to see that the further train is about to go onto the alternate track that we switched the track onto using Dontarez. So obviously if you try to screw around with the switch after this, it doesn't work anymore. So the game does have a pretty strict turn limit for you to reach the switch and make sure that you can stop it from blocking the refugees. Speaking of the refugees, you're about to see me arrange a lot of them in a straight line in front of the tracks. This is not just because most of them cannot cross it. You saw that I sent one guy across and then the rest of them stayed behind, even though like 1 or 2 of them could still cross. The main reason for this is if you do not do this, the Destonia soldier and the sniper that are standing right next to the track, they will actually sometimes cross track to attack the refugees. And this can be very frustrating to new players because you just don't expect it to happen. Or you might be too scared to cross the tracks because you think they're going to attack you immediately. But if you make them cross the tracks and then immediately stick to the opposite end of the road, for the most part they don't come bother you, especially if you use somebody to bait them the other way, which is what I'm about to do. But like I said, otherwise you kind of have to block the tracks in the way I'm doing here. And of course getting Dontarez into range to bait both the soldier and the snipers is also why we needed to have him interact with the switch diagonally in the last turn. It just allows him to be 1 block closer to the enemy so that he can get higher on their targeting priority. So that's obviously pretty important too. So a combination of a lot of these factors kind of end up making it so that this whole refugee rescue scenario is kind of a trial and error situation, which I think is another reason why a lot of newer players kind of hate this map. But at this point, the refugees are mostly safe now, so the hardest part of the map is pretty much behind us. So it's really just about cleaning up the enemies and making sure the 2 groups can reunite at the tail end of the tracks where the boss is waiting for us. From here on out, we're just going to mostly be inching towards the guy, but of course, as mentioned before, we want to pick up the treasures along the way. There's 3 treasures on this map, and I already mentioned the Gale Ring. One of the other ones is a healing drop near the beginning of the map that's on a tree. As I mentioned before, you can just buy them in the future, so it's not a high priority to get, so we're just skipping that one. It is still worth noting that healing drops cost 200 gold each, so I'm not going to skip over them if I can easily obtain them, but in this case, I couldn't spare anybody to go grab the healing drop. I mentioned that because gold management is actually very relevant in this run, and that's related to the final treasure on this map, which is a large mithril. So we've been collecting these slowly through the run. Most of them have just been hidden in chests and barrels and other things during the town exploration sections. This is going to be the first time we can obtain one on a map, and there's actually no way to come back to it later and obtain it. But on the topic of large mithrils, it is important that I obtain as many of them as I can, and in fact I'm pretty sure I obtain every single one possible within this run. Now, they're not going to come into play until way late into the run, because you're not allowed to really use them for anything until then. But the large mithril pieces alongside some small mithril pieces that you can find as well, and another item called the dark matter, it is actually important that you get as many of them as you can find in a run like this, both because of what you can actually make with the mithril itself, and also because the mithril can be used to manage your gold later on, which, as I just mentioned, is an important part of this run. Now, as far as gold management goes, you might have noticed that I have been kind of using medical herbs basically as often as I want, and that's because medical herbs really are not a big factor in gold management. Medical herbs only cost 10 gold each, and the antidote herbs cost 20. So really I could use 100 of them and it still wouldn't really be that costly. Somewhat related is that after this map, we are going to be, for the first time, be able to access direct upgrades to our character's weapons. And we're not going to have a problem affording any of those. Gold is really not an issue in this game until around Chapter 3. And until then, even playing the way I have been playing, where I haven't been grinding or stopping to kill every single enemy, I still have enough gold to buy basically whatever upgrades I need to get. So in about a minute here, you're going to see me lining up the refugees in front of the tracks and very near the Destonia soldiers that were chasing them. This might look like a very dangerous thing to be doing because you would think that instead I would want to run across the tracks and basically escape in the direction where my army began. But the thing about the Destonia soldiers chasing the refugees is that they kind of have a weird collective AI. They have this weird tendency to want to stick together, and a lot of times the result is that they will not cross the tracks themselves and they will get blocked by the train eventually. So keeping the refugees between the tracks is probably the safest place you can keep them. In fact, if you're not aware of this and you decided to move the refugees across the tracks and started moving them towards the starting point for your units, you're at risk of either aggroing the dwarf and the sniper that are near there and just having them kill the refugees. And I think there is a possibility that if you open up enough spaces, the Destonia soldiers that were originally chasing them will also cross the tracks. I think I've seen that happen once or twice before, but I may be misremembering. But the bottom line here ultimately is that you should try to keep the refugees between the tracks like I am here. There's no real reason to be moving them around after that. You can block off the Destonia soldiers that were chasing them, and then they'll just go off and do whatever for the rest of the map. And you use their high movement units that cross the tracks to take care of the small group of enemies that would have otherwise threatened them. So I do have a bit of extra time before we engage the final group of enemies and the boss. So this is probably as good a time as any to start talking about the different weapon types and how that might affect how your characters grow. Now, generally speaking, it isn't super relevant because most characters come with some amount of proficiency, or at least a lot more proficiency in one specific weapon subtype. And as a general rule in these games, it's probably better for you to stick to that subtype of weapons for that character, especially for a run like this where weapon experience is not going to be able to be given out very freely. That's also why in some cases where I could have gotten a weapon upgrade, it was still bad for the long-term development of my characters to go get that upgrade. So for example, I might have mentioned this already, but I had rapiers available to Symbios already, and it's been available for a couple maps now. And the first rapier available, the Epee, actually has one more attack than the steel sword that Symbios starts with, and in addition it actually has other stats on it as well. It actually gives 2 extra agility and critical +4. So from a pure stats perspective, it actually would have been a straight upgrade for Symbios. But of course, as I mentioned before, training in one specific weapon in this game does give you attack bonuses in the long run, and missing out on weapon levels also means missing out on special attacks for a longer period of time, and that is a pretty big deal. So even though I could have had a couple upgrades for some of my characters by now in terms of pure weapon attack power, for example, I could have gotten the Epee for Symbios, and I also could have gotten the Halberd for Dantares, and I also could have gotten a crossbow for Hayward if I really felt like it. But of course, I've already been training with their starting weapons since they joined, and there's really no reason to shift over because that would hurt my characters in the long run. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't situations within these games where you might want to switch a character off their, I guess what would be their quote canonical unquote weapon. And there are 2 main reasons you might do this. The first one might just be that the game has hidden values from you, and the character had a talent in certain weapons that weren't available to you in the start of the game. This is a pretty rare situation, but it mostly applies to the healers that you start the game with, which is, in Scenario 1 it's Grace, and in Scenario 2 it is Irudo. Both these characters actually start with a little bit of proficiency in Ankhs, so even putting aside the fact that the Ankh that I have at this point gives Grace access to Tornado, which has been very important in this map so far as you have seen, even if that wasn't the case, the game actually incentivizes you to switch her over to Ankhs just because she has some base skill in it anyway. But the second and more interesting situation that you might do this is because the set of specials or a certain set of weapons that are available in a certain subtype of weapons make you want to use that one more than whatever the primary weapon of that character is. Now, for the most part, this isn't much of a consideration because most base special attacks you get in this game just from weapon skill just provide a bit of extra damage and don't provide any sort of special effects. And even if you could trigger special effects, a lot of times because criticals are unreliable in that sense, it's not like you would rely on them anyway. It is, however, something still worth noting. For example, I have Hayward sticking with arrows. This means he's going to eventually learn the skill Hypno Arrow, which, as the name suggests, puts enemies to sleep. Now, as I just mentioned, it's obviously not something to be relied on because you not only have to activate a crit, but you also need to rely on it being the specific crit that you want. But it is still a nice thing to have for later on in the run. Not that it was relevant in the specific case of Hayward, just because he started with arrows anyway and not one of the other two subtypes of arrows. But had he started with something like crossbows, I might have opted to switch him to bows just because I wanted to get him that special eventually. And one final thing worth considering with weapon subtype choice, which is not actually going to be that relevant in this particular playthrough, is actually special attributes that sometimes apply to specific weapon subclasses, which basically gives them weapon triangle advantages against certain targets. So for example, most of the rapiers in the game, including the first rapier, the épée, are supposed to have the demon attribute, which is what it's called by most of the community, but it's more likened to like a mage killer effect, if that makes sense. So if you're using a weapon with the demon quality, you have weapon triangle advantage against a lot of targets, for example masked monks. And it also gives you weapon triangle advantage against certain magical creatures such as succubuses and magical constructs like golems and that sort of thing. And similarly, there are 3 types of mage weapons in this game, which is the Ankh, the wands, and the rods. Now, wands also have the demon attribute, so they also can do weapon triangle advantage against these magical constructs and stuff. But we didn't buy wands for Masquerade or Grace, although we will be getting a wand user in a couple maps. Masquerade is instead mainly using rods that she started with, and these weapons have the magic attribute, and for the most part, what they give you weapon triangle advantage against is monster type enemies. So for example, the worms that we met back in chapter 1, Masquerade actually would have had weapon triangle advantage against them. And of course, eventually we're going to run into other enemies like lizards and hellhounds and stuff that Masquerade will also have weapon triangle advantage against. And the final one here is Ankhs, which you can probably guess has the holy attribute, which you probably won't be too surprised if I tell you that Ankhs have weapon triangle advantage against mostly undead and evil type enemies. So stuff like skeletons and zombies, and occasionally some like dark mages and stuff will also have weapon triangle advantage against. Now, I just spent a lot of time talking about this, but for the most part, the mage weapons are the only case where we're going to get some kind of bonus from them, and it's usually not worth swapping our weapons around just to get weapon triangle advantage in that way. You might have also noticed that when I started talking about this, I said that rapiers are quote-unquote supposed to get the demon attribute, and that actually goes back to something I said in the introductory video to this run. So a glitch in Scenario 1 is that a lot of the weapons that are supposed to have extra weapon triangle advantage attributes actually don't have them. Or rather, I think they're flagged to have them, but because the game has like a problem with the code so that it doesn't really process them properly. So for example, rapiers are supposed to have the demon attribute, but they never do, because the game is too busy considering the fact that they are swords. This is a bug that is actually fixed in the retranslation patch for Scenario 1, but as I mentioned before, I am playing the original release of the game, so I am playing a version of the game where that is not going to be a factor. And honestly, even if it was, it probably still wouldn't be relevant because the game is structured very, very much so to encourage you to continue using swords with Symbios instead of switching them over to rapiers or blades. So you can see we're finally engaging with the final group of enemies on the map. The first thing we did was to engage them on a place in a turn order so that we can't give the mage an opportunity to act. So that of course means engaging them with some of our slower units, and then finishing them off with Masquerade early next turn. Unfortunately, the dwarves, which are a new enemy type on this map, they hit really hard, but they also are very slow. So we're just going to have to deal with taking a hit from them. But otherwise, we're going to save ourselves a lot of headache by having Masquerade just delete the entire group here. Now, the boss himself is a pretty big threat, and in fact he's strong enough to one-shot a lot of our units, including Masquerade. But because he's scripted to kind of just stand in place until we trigger him by moving to specific blocks, we can just avoid those blocks and have him waste his turn. Even though normally he would be able to walk up to Masquerade and just kill her in one hit. Not to mention Hayward, who only has 5 HP left. So once he wastes his turn, we have time to regroup, heal up, and then pile onto him. Once everyone gets topped off, it's not too big of an issue if somebody gets hit by him, except for, of course, for Masquerade, and also Abra, who also gets one shot by him. But that's not really a risk in this case because Masquerain of course can move before him, and we could just move her onto the darker patch of grass here, which has 30% land effect, and that's actually just enough to make sure she survives with 1 HP. And Albright moves after the boss, so that's not a concern either. So once we engage the boss, you're going to see that cutscene is going to happen. So the boss is an Imperial soldier, as I mentioned, and somehow, even though they're like a mile apart, the boss tries to plead Medion for help, and Medion basically just tells him to fuck off. So through situations like this, the game's narrative is trying to set up basically a mutual understanding and budding bromance between Symbios and Medion. And personally, I feel like this would be a lot more effective if it weren't for the fact that whichever character you're currently playing as have all their dialogue replaced with ellipses. So similar to how Shining Force 1 and 2 had mostly silent protagonists, Max had I think 1 line in the entirety of the game, and Bowie in Shining Force 2 I think had like 2 or 3 lines. But for the most part they really did not say anything, probably to let the player be able to project themselves onto an avatar unit of sorts. And they sort of try to accomplish the same thing in Shining Force 3 by having whichever viewpoint character you're playing as also become sort of silent, but also have them speak in ellipses and then have characters react as if they said something. It's an interesting way of doing it, and the game's narrative is simple enough that it's not that hard to figure out what they probably are saying anyway. But it is kind of weird, and I think I would have preferred the characters just speak normally. If you're familiar with Golden Sun, they pretty much continued this practice there, where Isaac was basically a silent protagonist in the first Golden Sun, and you would only get yes or no choices with him. And then when you switched over to the Lost Age, all of a sudden Isaac could talk a lot, and Felix became the silent protagonist. It's just one of those weird things that Camelot has stuck to and never really changed. But we're going to leave all that behind us as we finish off the boss here. You might have noticed that I'm about to get 2 straight ice arrow activations with Hayward. Now of course I'm still wearing the loincloth on the guy, so his critical hit rate is still pretty decent. But even if that wasn't the case and I got unlucky and didn't get 2 ice arrows with the guy, I obviously still had a number of things to fall back on. First of all, Dantares didn't get a critical hit despite the fact that he does have weapon triangle advantage, so that is a piece of reliability that I missed out on. But even if I didn't get a single crit, what I could have done instead is to follow up with Irene using a Tornado and then having Grace use Tornado. And with the extra damage from those 2 Tornado casts, it should have been enough to finish off the boss here, whether or not I got any crits. So the point here is to say that whatever the case, I would have been able to clear this map in 10 turns. So once we finish off the boss, he lets out a really funny cartoonish scream. It's a stock sound effect that the game is going to use a couple times. I don't know when they decided when and when not to use it, but you're going to hear it at the tail end of Chapter 3 as well. So at the end of this map, we do finally get a reward for saving all the refugees, which I guess I haven't mentioned up to this point. You get 10 experience points for every single refugee that you manage to rescue, so of course since we saved all 5 of them, we get 50 experience. And this of course is really nice no matter what kind of run you're doing, because if you were doing a really grindy run, that means that you started to get very little experience from enemies and you just got a huge bolus of experience for free here. But if you're playing like I am here and you're rushing through the game, this amount of experience is also very nice to help balance out some of the units that have been falling behind. And during this level up session, we also learn Heal 2 on Grace, which is actually going to be very useful in the next map. But yeah, that's Battle 8 completed in 10 turns. I'll see you guys next time.